Judge, for many years, you were on the bench, seen a lot of people repeat coming back in the system, and for some reason you thought a drug court would be a good thing to try. Why a drug court?
I went through the same process in coming to drug courts that probably most of particularly the early adapters did, and that is that they were on the bench, they were dealing with people coming through their system, and those people kept coming back all the time with repeat offenses, and as you dug a little bit into the reasons for their constant returns, you inevitably, in 80% of the circumstances, you'd find out that there was some substance abuse issue related to it. And it sort of began to become clear that unless something was done to address that issue, people were going to just keep coming back time and time again. And this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And at that time, the courts in Michigan and pretty much elsewhere were really overwhelmed with a lot of drug cases. Sure. The cocaine crisis was large, and the courts were pretty much reacting like everybody else in the justice system was, and in a kind of a knee-jerk reaction was that, well, you'll solve it all by locking people up. So that's what we did, and we did a good job of it, and locked a lot of people up, and unfortunately, for a long period of time. And I think some of us increasingly became dissatisfied with that.
You weren't seeing it solve the problem.
Wasn't solving the problem at all, yeah. And it wasn't being faithful to the system either. It was a bad business model. Actually, on the way over here, I heard an interview with Jim Hackett, who's the CEO of Ford. And he was talking about taking Ford into the future and beyond the stage where they simply made vehicles, which were, four wheels on a platform wrapped with some sort of a covering, and making them go down the highway, and that they needed to start looking at themselves as a part of that of which they're a part, and that is really a transportation world and a transportation system. And it struck me that that's really what happened with the drug courts. I think the people that got involved with that were pretty good at taking the basic vehicle and putting four wheels on it, wrapping it up and pushing it off to the next cog in the system, from police to prosecutors to courts to corrections, and moving it through, but they weren't really seeing themselves as a part of an entire system, and weren't thinking creatively about where they fit in that system, and what they could do better to contribute to the overall health of that system and build a better product. And ultimately, the product that seems, I think, people settled on as being the best way to define what the courts did and do is that it deals with people. And it's not just statistics, and it's not just moving cases, and it's not files, as some of the early judges used to emphasize. It's not just taking a file from here and putting it over there and moving it out. You got this flow of people going through, and those people are part of a community fabric, and the courts can either do a good job or a bad job of improving the product. And so it became clear that there might be something we could do better about that, and some way of treating that disorder that was such a large factor contributing to the problem that we were having, and interfering with with a good product. So, and then about that same time, there were some folks in the academic world who were doing some work with a theory that was developed that's variously known as therapeutic jurisprudence or therapeutic justice or restorative justice, perhaps. And it started to look like the basis for their work was that the justice system has the capacity to have, for their work, they came out of the world of psychology and law. The justice system has the capacity to positively or negatively influence and impact the people who are a part of that system, be they the folks that are caught up in it or the people that are administering it or everyone else. And being interested in psychology, their premise was that the system should do the most that it can to make that psychological impact a positive one. And it was sort of a logical transition to start thinking not only of the justice system as having the capacity to have that positive psychological impact, but impact in other areas too, such as mental health and substance use disorders and family life and everything like that. And the court system seemed to be a kind of a good vehicle, a good core around which to address all these issues, because they could summon people and ideas from these various systems if the court would only see itself as a part of that whole system, as Ford would want to see itself as a part of a transportation system. If the courts can see themselves as a part of a person's system, perhaps, or a system of community health, it could construct something that would work in that way. And then some guy down in Florida started thinking about drug courts.
Well, and you were the first one in Michigan to set a drug court up in Michigan. And it was, obviously back then, this is a new approach to the court system and how we treated, now we call them participants, but how we treated defendants at that time. Was this something easy to set up and get everybody in agreement to, or what kind of work did you have to do to persuade the prosecutor, the sheriff, the defense attorneys to work together in this whole effort?
The first people I had to convince that it was worth trying were my colleague judges. As we were, the culture in our court was that no one judge would run off and do something on his or her own without a consensus from the other judges. And it was not, I would say, overwhelmingly received with enthusiasm when I first started talking about it by my colleagues, and they it seemed to me the best way to try to get it moving was to educate them. And so I probably spent 6-8 months at least gathering every bit of information I could get about substance use disorders, which is what we were focusing on at the time, and specifically drug use. Everything related to drug use and crime and solving the knot that those two presented for each other. Everything I could get a hold of, I just swamped them with it and kept sending them stuff. And I who knows if they read any of it or not. But I thought if I could just get them to start thinking about it, it might make it easier than just walking in one day and saying, we should start a drug court. And so as time went on, I kept nudging it a little bit and bringing it up. And finally they adopted, I think, a sort of a benign neglect attitude towards me. and decided, look, don't get me screwed up, don't mess up my work, don't mess up the court, don't cause us problems. And if you want to go off and try doing something on this vein, go ahead and do it, and we'll see where it goes. And so I happened to have the opportunity to go to a conference put on by MJI at that time with the chief probation officer who I selected to go with me from Kalamazoo County, who was a guy named Dick Kreitz. And the subject of this conference was something along the lines of sentencing alternatives for felony substance abuse offenders, which is kind of the way it was referred to back then. And the idea was to gather for several days, listen to some pitches about what some people were doing to address the problem of so many substance abusers in the court system that might be helpful. And then we were tasked to go back to our own jurisdiction, and after about a 6-8 month period, something like that, come back with a plan to do something that would work in our jurisdiction. So we went and listened, and one of the speakers happened to be Judge Goldstein from Florida, from Miami-Dade Court, along with his chief, I think at that time he was a court administrator named Tim Murray. They had started what they called a drug court down in Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade was really plagued with problems in this area because it was a funnel. The Miami area was just a funnel for drugs coming into, and South Florida in general, drugs coming into the rest of the country as they made their way up from South America and Central America. So they had horrible problems in Miami-Dade. And this guy, Goldstein, was a former cop, tough as nails, and hardly out of a abundance of compassion, but just because he wanted to do something that might make a difference, decided that maybe treating these people, and it's a very fundamental, this is not rocket science. It's if we treat these folks, maybe they won't come back. And so that's what he did. He had a very good personality for it. He was a good salesman and fairly flamboyant. And so ABC or one of the big networks got a hold of it, and they did a special on his work, and that was a part of the presentation. So there were others that were discussed over a period of 3 days, I think. Dick Kreitz and I decided that this drug court sounded like something that we might like to try in Kalamazoo. So we went back and worked through our community corrections department, which was a well-established, well-functioning cooperative venture between the courts, the law enforcement, and corrections to deal with probationers. And there was a woman running it named Tammy Woodhams, who was very creative and energetic and somebody who liked to try different things. And she saw that, and Kreitz and I felt that this would be a good vehicle to use to try to pull this together, because it became clear to us in the beginning that it wasn't something that we could make work without making it a cooperative venture that would include law enforcement, corrections, prosecutor's office, and the courts. And they had that system kind of set up in community corrections. And just so happened the sheriff at the time, Tom Edmonds, was the chair of that board that ran that system in Kalamazoo County. So we started working with her, and over a period of time put a plan together as to what it might look like. basing it on some reading, as I recall, that was available, and also on what this guy did down in Miami-Dade. And started to talk the same kind of information I had been funneling to judges. I started funneling to these other people: prosecutors, sheriffs, law enforcement, corrections. And we had Dick Kreitz from the Department of Corrections as a part of it, so that it was a ready-made connection there. And so the idea evolved eventually that we would put together what we called a policy council. It was really a task force that made up of all the people who had clients who may have some connection with the criminal justice system. We got them together to talk about it, and it included the county board, county executive, mental health, corrections department, the prosecutor, the sheriff. And by that time, they all kind of began to think that maybe this was something they'd at least be willing to look at. We had a series of meetings over a long period of time, and talked about it. We were able to get some grant money. There was a fair amount of federal money starting to flow towards this work back in the early 90s. And money became available to get some travel of some of the key players in this group to some conferences to talk about the nexus of substance use disorders and criminal justice and repeat criminal behavior and everything like that. And it got to the point finally where they were willing to launch it. So we did the planning and hung out a shingle one day and said, this is it. We're going to start. And we did and carried on from there.
From what I've heard, and then what you said is it wasn't something that was automatically done. It took a lot of preparation and work and communication with all the various partners to get them on board to understand the importance of it.
It did. And not a hindrance, but one of the challenges of doing this in Kalamazoo County was as a very conservative county. Prosecutor was very conservative. The sheriff described himself as being slightly to the right of Attila the Hun. The culture was not one of being so-called soft on crime, but rather being hard on crime, and that's what politicians ran on, is the benefits to the community of being hard on crime. So it was clear that if you just butted heads with that culture, you weren't going to go anywhere, and it just took a soft sell. And the product, it sells itself. I mean, once you get them willing to be open and to listen to it and think about it and consider it, it makes sense. And so some of our strongest advocates over time became the prosecutor and the sheriff, which was a quantum leap for that. And then as things began to happen and the other judges began to get a little familiar with it, some of them decided they'd like to maybe try that. So it created opportunities for expanding it. And, I've always felt that when you do one of these things, anything like this, you need to plan for the time when you're going to stop doing it so that there'll be people there to do it. So as much as I could, I'd get other judges to sit in the court and try this stuff out. And I'd try to get them to go to conferences and things like that. And that paid off, and they started to get comfortable with it. They became persuaded by it, and they became advocates for it.
So you started a drug court. A few others are starting to build and come along, and at some point there's talk about creating an association. What becomes known now as MATCP, but at that time it was MATCP. What was the thought process behind creating MATCP? Who were some of the ones there that you worked with to build this organization?
The association thing actually began on a national level rather than local. Early on, as people began to talk about these things and get interested in them, it became clear that there were about 10 or 12 jurisdictions in the country that had jumped into it. California, there were a couple courts out there in Hayward and Oakland. There was the Miami-Dade court. There was some work being done in Florida around Broward County. There was some work being done in the East Coast, Massachusetts. And these folks were all kind of loosely connected and interested in this topic, began to communicate a little bit with each other. And at some point, someone, I can't even remember who it was, I think it was probably Jeff Tauber from California, decided it was time for this loosely connected group to sit down together and see what they could do to cooperate with each other and advocate for expanding the work. And so that group met in Washington, D.C., and it began affiliated with an established corrections association that had been operating for years, and the idea was that this would be a positive contribution in the world of corrections. So this, under that umbrella, this group gathered and decided to form the National Association. I'm going to guess, I don't remember the dates, but I would guess that happened sometime around 1992 to 1994, somewhere in there, and over a series of different meetings that were held. And so that association got formed and started to hold conferences, which kind of expanded the net of interest and drew in other people. And again, fortunately, there was a lot of federal money available that could make it possible for these folks to come to these kinds of things. And then at some point, and I'm going to rely on the better memory of my friend and colleague Harvey Hoffman to tell me some dates here and exactly what happened. But this woman that I mentioned, Tammy Woodhams in Kalamazoo, who became sort of the manager for the Kalamazoo Drug Court. And I started thinking that it might be useful to have some kind of a gathering of people in Michigan to talk about doing this. And at that point, we reached out, and voila, Harvey showed up. And I'm not sure exactly how or why. There was an initial conference. My memory is before the association was formed in Kalamazoo, and Tammy was a part of that planning. I was a part of it. Harvey was a part of it. I know there were others. I expect Dick Kreitz from our operation was a part of it. And somehow Harvey had discovered this and got interested in it. And we started meeting to talk about a state association and kind of decided to announce it. And I think, and again, Harvey helped me, but probably said, we're going to have a conference. Maybe that was the conference in Kalamazoo. I don't remember, to be honest with you. But there was an initial conference there. I think about 150 people came to that, maybe 125. And it was wildly successful. People came and we had to cut it off. There was more interest in it than we expected. And I think we use that, I'm sure, as a vehicle for expanding the notion of a state association. So with that, we started up. And that was it. It was a number of meetings at the old poorhouse in outside Lansing. That was the of all places to start an association to treat substance use disorders. But it started, and we threw together some bylaws, and there were people there, I think, probably from Detroit. Somebody from Detroit Wayne County area must have been on board, and it kept growing.
And you became the first president of the association. What was that like?
That was like I got stuck with something I didn't want, and like I couldn't wait to pass it on to somebody, and it was obvious that Harvey Hoffman was the person it had to be passed on to. And there's a story he keeps reminding me. I don't remember this, but he can tell you that I promised him it was an easy job, not a lot of work. You just kind of had to show up now and then, and it would take care of itself. And well, Harvey, being Harvey, would not be satisfied with that anyway. So Harvey really is the one who grew the association, and frankly grew the drug court movement in Michigan by really institutionalizing it. You know, it went through two states. One is a kind of an early adaptation to it. The second is institutionalizing it, and that's all Harvey that did that, and others. But he really he had the vision for that, and saw that could be done, and he just had the mind for creating an association that could see how it would be set up and everything like that. And he also saw significantly the expansion of the idea of the drug treatment courts to a system that would also treat initially people that were alcohol abusers, because he came from that segment of the court system with the alcohol offenses, and so he could easily envision that, and then he envisioned the legislative path of this to, which was a big deal. This question, there was a lot of talk about whether we'd benefit from legislation or from just staying under the radar and trying not to raise anybody questioning it from higher up. But Harvey had the appropriate vision of not only building the association, but building a legislative structure around that work that would help it to gain legitimacy and to expand and thrive with the blessings of people who could otherwise blow it out of the water if they didn't like what they saw, and that turned out to be wildly successful, and pretty much. And I got out of that position as quickly as I could.
Although, from what I've heard from Ms. Hoffman and from others, you are minimizing your role as well, though, I think. And it sounds, from what I'm hearing right now, is you were an instrumental role in this whole setup and starting the first drug court and getting people on board, and then building others around the state to come on board. All of you played a role, I don't doubt that. It was a team effort.
Well, it was a team effort, and I think to get something like that going, you need some missionaries, some people that are just fanatical about it, and we gradually, I became really fanatical about it because I believed so intensely in it, talked about it a lot, wrote about it a good bit, and tried to network do some networking that would build it with other judges that were doing the work, and the academic world, which complemented what was going on, and also the medical world. It was clear that had a role to play, the medical societies, and particularly ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, through an addiction doc in Kalamazoo. We got in with them and did some work with ASAM as well, and also some work with academics, and talked about it a lot. And that was all stuff that was going on in the background that contributed to the legitimacy, I think, of the whole operation. And I was, like I said, I was very excited about that and got very involved in it. And to the extent that contributed to it, then it contributed to it.
So, 20 years later, the association has grown to hundreds and hundreds of people that are involved. Number of drug courts around the country, around the state, sobriety courts, veterans courts, it's expanded tremendously. And our conferences now are, over 1,000 people now attend. Back from 150 to over 1,000 now from around the state. What do you think about that? How does that feel? And how do you see how things have been going?
Well, I'm thrilled with what's happened to it, because going back to the original picture I drew, I guess I think the courts have changed the way they, at least as they deal in this area, the courts have changed the way that they relate to their communities and to the entire criminal justice system. And I'm proud of the fact that the courts have taken the lead in this. They've dragged other people, prosecutors, law enforcement, and corrections, dragged them along into it. And it was by virtue of the legitimacy that a number of judges who were the early adapters gave to the whole idea. It was harder to blow it off when you had judges that were interested in doing it and were willing, clearly, to risk a lot of political capital in the process. And so people were prepared to listen to that. So, and it did change, I think, the way that the courts operate. Kalamazoo is the system I'm obviously most familiar with, but they now have something like 7 treatment courts, which is how they're now known, or problem-solving courts. And it deals with everything from mental health to drug abuse to family problems to alcohol abuse and use disorders. And that's had a huge impact on the way judges judge. And all of that is it's a sea change in what all of us early judges who were on board back in the 80s and 90s, what we were trained to think of judges as doing, which was calling balls and strikes and making decisions based on evidence and Constitution and laws and things like that. Judges became problem solvers. Courts became problem solvers. And that was a part of the genesis that was so dramatic. And when you think of 20 years to get that done, 25, I guess now, that's not really a long time to get that much of a shift. It's a far cry from early on. Early on, I got called into Lansing to the Hall of Justice to one of the members of the court, who shall remain unnamed, that took a very dim view of drug court work. And I'd done some writing, and I walked in, and the writing that I had done was laid out at the justice's desk, and obviously had been studied and was red marked and taped and everything else. And I was kind of required to defend the thing because it was seen as too different from what judges do, and I think now there's considerable acceptance, and that feels really good. It feels like there's been something good that's happened, and not just this whole notion of locking people up. And that there have been a lot of lives saved and a lot of people restored to family and community that never would have been but for this approach. So that I'm proud of that.
And how about the association? How do you feel about that?
It's been instrumental, critical. It couldn't have happened without the association. That was the vehicle that did all the things that needed to be done. It expanded the network. It networked people together. It educated people. It gave legitimacy to it. And its importance is, proof is in the pudding. I mean, you've got 1,000+ people that come to conferences now. The association's involved in reaching out, has relationships with the Supreme Court, with the legislatures, with training. Now with efforts to create housing opportunities for people that are in treatment courts, because people in treatment courts frequently have housing problems. In Michigan, not only has the number of people attending these meetings grown, but the drug courts have exploded here in Michigan, and it's because there's been an association behind it, giving it impetus and giving it direction, keeping it from going off course, which was really important when something like this was starting out. There was more than one judge who started to kind of, go beyond some imaginary guardrails at that time. And the association was a vehicle that could reestablish guardrails, keep people focused on the right way to do this, because there's a right way and there's a very wrong way. And the fact that there, to my knowledge, has never been a blow-up of any treatment court in Michigan is largely attributable, I think, to the fact that the association is directing its course and helping it to grow and keeping it directed in the right to the right methods, using the latest science and the latest education to get the job done.
Judge May, why don't you come back and ask that same question, and then we're going to do the joint thing here with Harvey.
Okay. I want to know if it's going to turn him into a Democrat. That's what that's what I'm looking for.
You and Mackenzie. Right, so do we want to?
Well, first off, we'll have him sit here, and then we'll. I'm going to do that one question with you, sir.
What was that question? I don't remember.
Was it worthwhile?
Was it worthwhile? Oh, yes. Yes.
And then we will. So Judge May, was being a treatment court judge, being involved with MATCP, but treatment court judge especially, was that something worthwhile for you?
Looking back on the whole adventure, I guess I'd call it, I really think it was, for me, the most important thing I did as a judge. There's no question about it. It's important to call balls and strikes, and it's important to administer the judicial system, and wherever your bailiwick happens to be, and it's important to do it efficiently and fairly and all of that. But ultimately, I just really believe that we're dealing with human beings, and as long as we're dealing with human beings, we we have to do the best for them that we possibly can, if it can be done within the context of running a court, which means you observe due process, that you follow the Constitution and laws, and it turns out there's a whole lot you can do in that context. So we're the trial court judges. It's not the appellate judges that did this. It's not the Supremes. It's the trial judges, and they're the judges, district, circuit, that see human beings day after day with their problems and their lives on full display, good and bad, in the courtrooms. And it's nice to have been able, after 20 years on the bench, to walk away from it saying that you've seen more than just the bad of human existence, that you've seen what can be really good about it, and what can be really good in your colleagues too. Judge Hoffman talks about being changed by being a drug court, treatment court judge, and I think we all feel that way. We have been positively changed. We're better people. We're better judges, but also just better people for the work we've done. It's more compassionate, it's more humane, and the good news is it's more effective. That's the bottom line.